There is a kind of prison that does not have walls, no locks, no chains, no visible boundaries. And yet, millions of people live inside it every day. This prison is not built from metal. It is built from memory. And the bars are made from something very subtle: unfinished emotions, unresolved thoughts, and repeated mental replay of the past. This is what psychology calls rumination, a silent loop in the mind where the same event is replayed again and again. Not because it is useful, but because the mind has not learned how to release it. You may think you are simply thinking about the past, but in reality, you are reliving it emotionally. Every time you replay a hurtful memory, your nervous system reacts as if it is happening again. Not symbolically, but biologically. Your body responds. Your emotions activate. Your stress system engages, even though nothing new is happening in the present moment. This is why rumination feels so heavy. It is not just thought. It is emotional re-experience. Psychologists like Aaron Beck, who developed cognitive therapy, discovered something important. Depression and emotional suffering are often maintained not by events themselves, but by the repeated interpretation of those events in the mind. In simple words, it is not what happened that keeps hurting you. It is how often you revisit it mentally, and each revisit strengthens the emotional imprint. Now let's go deeper. Why does the mind do this? Why does it repeat pain instead of releasing it? The answer is not weakness, it is protection. Your brain is trying to solve an unsolved emotional equation. It keeps replaying the memory because it is searching for closure, a different outcome, a different ending, a moment where the emotional charge finally makes sense. But here is the problem. The past cannot change, no matter how many times you replay it. So the mind stays stuck in a loop that has no resolution, and that loop becomes emotional exhaustion. This is where forgiveness psychology begins, because forgiveness is not what people think it is. It is not about saying, "What happened was okay." It is not about forgetting, and it is not about excusing behavior. In psychology, forgiveness is defined as the process of releasing emotional attachment to a past event so it no longer controls your present state. This means forgiveness is not for the other person. It is for your nervous system. It is a way of telling your brain, this event is no longer happening. This memory does not need to be active anymore. But the mind resists this process, because holding on to pain creates a false sense of control. If you keep replaying something, it feels like you are still connected to it. And if you are connected to it, it feels like you are not powerless, even though, in reality, you are still suffering. So now, you are standing between two forces: rumination and release. One keeps you mentally inside the past. The other brings you back to the present. One feels familiar. The other feels uncertain. And the mind always chooses familiarity first, even when it hurts. There is a hidden reason why people cannot move on from painful experiences. It is not because they want to suffer, and it is not because they enjoy the pain. It is because the mind does something very subtle and very powerful. It turns pain into identity. When an emotional experience repeats in your thoughts for long enough, your brain stops treating it as an event and starts treating it as part of who you are. This is where rumination becomes dangerous, because the memory is no longer just a memory. It becomes a mental environment you live inside. You don't just remember the past, you inhabit it. Psychology shows that the brain is a meaning-making system. It doesn't only store events, it stores interpretations of events. So when something painful happens, the mind doesn't only record what happened, it also records, what does this say about me? What does this mean about others? What does this mean about life? And over time, these meanings become emotional beliefs. For example, I am not valued. People leave. I cannot trust anyone. These beliefs don't feel like thoughts. They feel like truth. And once something feels like truth, the mind starts protecting it, even if it is painful, because to the brain, familiar pain is safer than unknown peace. This is where rumination becomes a loop. You think about the past. The past triggers emotion. The emotion reinforces the belief. And the belief pulls you back into thinking about the past again. It is a closed system, a cycle that feeds itself. Psychologist Sigmund Freud described something very similar called repetition compulsion. He observed that humans often repeat emotional patterns, even painful ones, unconsciously, not because they enjoy them, but because the mind is trying to resolve an unresolved emotional conflict. It is like the brain is saying, "This time, let me understand it. This time, let me fix it. This time, let me make it make sense." But the problem is, the mind is trying to solve an emotional experience using thinking alone, and emotional wounds are not solved through thinking. They are processed through feeling and release. So the loop continues, and over time, this loop becomes mental exhaustion, because the mind is working constantly, without ever reaching resolution. This is why rumination feels draining. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because your brain is stuck in unfinished emotional processing. Now here is an important distinction. There is a difference between remembering and rumination. Remembering is neutral. It is awareness of the past without emotional reactivation. Rumination is emotional re-experiencing of the past in the present. One is observation, the other is reliving. And most people confuse the two. They think they are just thinking, but internally, their nervous system is reliving the experience again and again. This is why emotional pain does not fade when rumination continues, because every repetition reactivates the emotional network. The brain cannot distinguish between real-time experience and vividly recalled emotional memory. So, each replay strengthens the same neural pathway. This is how emotional loops become stronger over time, not weaker unless interrupted. Let's go deeper now, because to understand forgiveness, you must first understand what your mind is doing when you are not controlling it. Most people believe they are in control of their thoughts, but psychology shows something very different. When your attention is not focused on a task, your brain does not become quiet. It becomes active in a specific system called the default mode. This is the part of the brain that starts thinking about the past, the future, yourself, your identity, unfinished emotional stories. In simple terms, when you are not focused, your mind turns inward automatically. This is not a flaw. It is a built-in survival system. But here is where the problem begins. If you have emotional pain that was never resolved, your default mode does not stay neutral. It goes searching. It starts replaying. It starts analyzing. It starts questioning. And most importantly, it starts constructing meaning out of emotional wounds. This is where rumination is born, because the brain is trying to complete something that was never completed emotionally. Neuroscience research shows that this default thinking network is highly active in people who struggle with overthinking and depression. It is like the mind becomes a storyteller, and you are the character trapped inside the story. This is why silence often makes people overthink more, because silence removes external input, and the default system takes over fully. Now, there is something very important to understand. Your brain is not trying to hurt you. It is trying to solve something, but it is using the wrong tool. It is using thought to solve emotional pain. And that is like trying to clean fire with fire. It doesn't work. Instead, it intensifies the experience. There is another key mechanism involved here. The brain loves prediction. It hates uncertainty. So, when something painful happens, and the mind does not get closure, it creates predictions to fill the gap. For example, this will happen again. People always leave. I cannot trust again. These are not facts. They are predictive defenses. The brain prefers a painful certainty over an uncertain future, because uncertainty feels like danger. So the mind locks into rumination as a form of control. If I keep thinking about it, I can prevent it from happening again. This is the illusion, but it feels very real. And this is where forgiveness becomes difficult. Because forgiveness requires uncertainty. It requires letting go without full control. And the brain resists that deeply. Now let's connect this to emotional memory. Every time you replay a painful memory, you are not just recalling it. You are reactivating the same neural network that was formed during the original experience. So your body responds as if it is happening again. Heart rate changes, stress hormones activate, muscle tension increases, even though nothing is physically happening in the present. This is why rumination feels physically draining. You are not just thinking, you are reliving in fragments. And over time, this creates a loop where the brain becomes addicted to the emotional charge of the memory. Not because pain is enjoyable, but because the brain becomes familiar with the pattern. Familiarity feels safe, even when it is harmful. So the mind chooses the known pain over unknown peace. This is the paradox of rumination. It feels like suffering, but to the brain, it feels like stability. And until this loop is interrupted, forgiveness cannot fully take root. Because forgiveness is not just a moral act, it is a neurological shift, a release of emotional prediction, a stopping of mental reactivation. And that is why it feels so difficult. Not because you are weak, but because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do, just in the wrong direction. Now, we arrive at one of the most misunderstood parts of forgiveness. Why does letting go feel so uncomfortable? Why does the mind resist release, even when it clearly causes suffering? The answer is not emotional weakness. It is control, or more precisely, the illusion of control. When something painful happens in your life, and it remains unresolved, the mind does something very subtle. It starts building a control system around the pain. It says, if I keep thinking about it, I won't be surprised again. If I analyze it enough, I will understand it. If I replay it, I will prevent it from happening again. This creates a false sense of safety, because rumination feels like preparation. But in reality, it is repetition, not preparation. And here is the key truth. Letting go feels dangerous to the mind, because it feels like giving up control over prevention. So even when the pain is heavy, the mind holds on. Because holding on feels like power, but releasing feels like vulnerability. Psychologically, this is where attachment forms. Not attachment to the person, but attachment to the emotional story. The story becomes, I need to remember this so it never happens again. Over time, that story becomes part of identity. And identity is the hardest thing for the brain to release, because your identity is your internal reference point. It tells you who you are, what to expect, how to behave, what is safe. So when pain becomes part of identity, letting go feels like losing a part of yourself, even if that part is suffering. This is why people stay stuck in emotional cycles for years, not because they don't understand what happened, but because a part of them believes, if I let this go, I lose protection. Now here is something deeper. The human brain is not just a thinking machine. It is a prediction machine. It constantly builds models of the world based on past experience. So when you experience betrayal, loss, rejection, or emotional pain, the brain updates its model, and that model begins to influence all future expectations. For example, if I trust, I will get hurt. If I open up, I will be abandoned. If I forgive, I will be weak. These are not conscious beliefs at first. They are emotional predictions stored in the nervous system. And this is why forgiveness feels like exposure, because forgiveness removes the emotional armor. It removes the prediction that protects you from repetition of pain. But here is the paradox. The armor that protects you is also the cage that keeps you stuck. The very thing that feels like safety is what keeps the emotional wound alive. Now let's talk about something very important. People often think forgiveness means forgetting, excusing, approving, or reconciling. But psychologically, forgiveness is none of these. Forgiveness is the release of emotional rehearsal. It is the stopping of mental re-experiencing. It is the decision to no longer feed the neural loop. Because every time you replay the story, you are not just remembering. You are reinforcing. You are reactivating the same emotional circuitry. And the brain learns this is still happening. So the wound stays alive. Not because the past is present, but because the mind keeps bringing the past into the present. Now here is the turning point. Control is not healing. Control is stabilization of pain. And forgiveness begins where control ends. This is why it feels like a loss. But in reality, it is the first real step toward freedom. Because when control stops, the brain no longer has fuel to maintain the loop. And slowly, the emotional system begins to settle. Not instantly, but naturally, like a storm losing energy when the wind stops feeding it. And this is where transformation begins, not in forcing peace, but in stopping the reinforcement of pain. Now, we go even deeper, because there is something most people never realize about emotional suffering. It can become addictive, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, psychological way that feels completely normal. The mind can become attached to pain, not because pain is enjoyable, but because pain becomes familiar. And familiarity, to the brain, feels like safety. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms behind rumination. When an emotional experience repeats long enough, the nervous system begins to recognize it as known territory, and the brain prefers known suffering over unknown peace. Why? Because unknown peace feels uncertain, and uncertainty to the brain feels like risk. So even when a person says, "I want to move on," a deeper part of the mind resists. Because moving on means stepping into an identity the brain has not rehearsed yet. Now let's break this down clearly. Every emotional state you repeat becomes a pattern, and every pattern that repeats becomes familiar, and everything familiar becomes emotionally comfortable, even pain. This is how rumination turns into addiction. Not because you want pain, but because your brain knows how to function inside it. This is why people sometimes return to memories that hurt them. Not consciously, but automatically. The mind says, "Let me think about it again. Let me understand it one more time. Let me figure out why it happened." But underneath that logic is emotional familiarity. Now here is where identity becomes important. Because repeated emotional states don't just affect thoughts, they affect self-perception. If you repeatedly think, "I was wronged, I was hurt, I was betrayed," over time, the mind doesn't just store the event, it stores the identity of the experiencer. I am someone who was hurt. I am someone who cannot trust. I am someone who was abandoned. This is where the victim identity forms. And once identity forms, it protects itself, even if it causes suffering. Because identity feels like survival. So now, the mind does something very important. It resists letting go of the story. Because the story supports identity. If the story disappears, the identity feels unstable. This is why forgiveness feels threatening at a deeper level, not morally, but psychologically. Because forgiveness says, "You are no longer that story." And the mind responds, "If I am not that story, then who am I?" This identity uncertainty is uncomfortable, so the brain returns to rumination. Because rumination reinforces the known self. Now let's go deeper into the emotional loop. Every time you replay a painful memory, three things happen. The emotional state is reactivated. The identity is reinforced. The neural pathway becomes stronger. So instead of healing, the system stabilizes the wound. This is why some people feel stuck for years, not because time isn't passing, but because the same emotional circuit is being rehearsed repeatedly. Now here is a powerful insight. The mind does not distinguish between useful repetition and harmful repetition. It only recognizes repetition as importance. So whatever you repeat, you strengthen. Whatever you strengthen becomes your default emotional state. This is why rumination is so powerful. It is not just thinking, it is conditioning. And here is the paradox. The more you try to solve the pain through thinking, the more you reinforce it, because thinking keeps the loop alive. Now let's talk about something subtle but important. People often confuse reflection with rumination. Reflection brings clarity. Rumination brings emotional reactivation. Reflection moves toward resolution. Rumination moves in circles. Reflection ends. Rumination repeats. And most people unknowingly stay in repetition, believing they are trying to heal, but they are actually maintaining the emotional system. Now we come to a critical turning point. To break the addiction to pain, you cannot fight the thoughts, because fighting keeps attention on them. You must interrupt the reinforcement cycle. This is not about suppression, it is about disengagement. Because what the brain no longer feeds, it eventually stops growing. And this is where forgiveness begins to take root. Not as an idea, but as a withdrawal from emotional repetition. A quiet step back from the story, not forgetting it, not denying it, but no longer reliving it. And that is where freedom slowly begins. Now we reach a very important shift in understanding, because many people stay stuck for one simple reason. They are waiting for closure. They believe that in order to move on, they must fully understand what happened. They must get answers. They must feel it makes sense. But psychologically, closure is often not something you receive. It is something you create. And this changes everything. Because the brain loves completion. It wants the story to end neatly. It wants logic, explanation, and resolution. So when something painful happens, without answers, the mind refuses to close the loop. It keeps it open. It replays it. It reanalyzes it. It searches for missing meaning. But here is the truth. Some emotional experiences do not come with full explanations. And the mind struggles with that, because uncertainty feels unfinished, and unfinished loops feel unsafe. So the brain keeps running the story, trying to solve what cannot be solved through thinking alone. Now here is where neuroscience becomes important. Emotional memories are stored differently than logical memories. Logical memory can be resolved with understanding, but emotional memory is stored in the nervous system, in patterns of activation, in physiological responses. This means you don't think your way out of emotional loops. You regulate your way out of them. And this is where most people get stuck. They try to find closure in the mind, when the real process happens in the body. Now let's talk about how rumination actually weakens. When a memory is repeatedly activated, it strengthens the emotional circuit. But when the activation stops, the circuit begins to weaken over time. This is called neural deconditioning. In simple terms, what is not used begins to fade. But there is a catch. The brain does not naturally stop reactivating emotional loops unless something interrupts the pattern. That interruption is awareness without engagement. Not suppression, not avoidance, but observation without re-entry into the story. Now let's go deeper. One of the biggest illusions about healing is this. If I fully understand why it happened, I will be free. But understanding alone does not release emotional charge. You can understand a painful event perfectly and still feel emotionally stuck, because understanding is cognitive, but pain is somatic, stored in the body. So closure is not a mental conclusion. It is a nervous system shift. Now here is what actually begins release. When the brain tries to replay a painful memory and you do not follow it into the story, something changes. The loop loses reinforcement, because rumination requires participation. It requires engagement. It requires attention that feeds it. Without that fuel, the loop weakens. This is why silence, awareness, and present moment anchoring are powerful. Not because they erase memory, but because they stop emotional reactivation. Now let's make something very clear. Forgiveness is not forgetting, and it is not justification. Forgiveness is the withdrawal of emotional investment from the replay. It is saying internally, this story no longer needs to be relived. And that single shift is where healing begins. Now let's talk about why the brain resists this. Because rumination creates a false sense of control. The mind believes, if I keep thinking, I stay prepared. But in reality, it is just keeping the wound active. So when you stop engaging, the mind initially feels discomfort because it is losing its habitual cycle. But this discomfort is not danger. It is withdrawal, like a system adjusting to the absence of constant stimulation. And if you stay with that stillness, something very important happens. The emotional charge begins to fade, not instantly, but gradually, like a wave losing energy when it stops being reinforced. Now here is a key insight. Most emotional pain does not disappear because it is healed. It disappears because it is no longer activated, and activation is a choice of attention, even if unconscious. So every time you refuse to re-enter the loop, you are breaking the cycle. And every time you break the cycle, you weaken the emotional grip. This is how forgiveness begins to emerge naturally, not as a forced decision, but as a result of decreased reactivation, a quiet shift from reliving to remembering without emotion. And that is the real turning point. Now, we move into something deeper than thoughts, because forgiveness is not decided in the mind. It is completed in the nervous system. Most people think they forgive when they decide to forgive. But real forgiveness is not a decision. It is a physiological shift, a quiet change in how your body responds to a memory. When an emotional wound is still active, the body reacts instantly when the memory appears. There may be tension in the chest, a tightness in the stomach, a subtle stress response, even if no words are spoken. This is because emotional memory is stored in the body as activation patterns, not just thoughts. Now here is the key transition point, when rumination reduces and the loop is no longer constantly reinforced. The nervous system begins to reorganize itself. This is where something very subtle happens. The memory is still there, but the emotional charge attached to it starts to weaken. It no longer triggers the same intensity of reaction. This is the beginning of emotional detachment, not indifference, but neutrality. Now let's understand why this shift feels strange at first. When you have carried emotional pain for a long time, your nervous system adapts to it. It becomes familiar with activation. So when the activation begins to fade, the mind interprets it as emptiness or even discomfort, because the system is used to feeling something, even if that something was pain. This is why many people unconsciously return to rumination, because emotional silence feels unfamiliar. But here is the truth, that silence is not emptiness. It is recalibration. The nervous system is learning a new baseline. Now let's go deeper into how release actually happens biologically. Every emotional memory has three components: the event, the interpretation, the bodily response. Rumination keeps all three active. Forgiveness interrupts the third one first: the bodily response. When the body stops reacting, the emotional memory loses its power. Because emotion is not just thought, it is body activation linked to thought. So when the body no longer responds, the memory becomes neutral information, not an emotional trigger. Now here is something very important. You do not erase emotional memory. You change your relationship to its activation. This is the foundation of psychological healing. Now let's talk about why forgiveness often feels like loss at first. When the emotional charge begins to fade, the identity that was built around that pain also starts to weaken. And this creates a strange experience. You may feel like something is missing, because the mind was using the emotional story as a reference point. Even if it was painful, it was familiar. And familiarity creates structure in identity. So when that structure dissolves, the mind temporarily feels unstable. This is where many people unconsciously return to old memories, not because they want pain, but because they want structure. But if you stay in the neutral state, something important begins to form, a new baseline, a calmer internal state that is not dependent on emotional replay. Now let's be clear about something. Forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is no longer reliving what happened. There is a huge difference. One keeps you inside the experience. The other places you outside of it. Now here is the most important insight in this part. The nervous system does not heal through explanation. It heals through absence of reactivation. Every time you do not engage with the loop, you are allowing the system to reset. And every time the system resets, the emotional intensity decreases, not because the past changes, but because your body stops responding as if it is still happening. This is real forgiveness at the biological level. Not emotional justification, not moral reasoning, but nervous system neutrality. And when neutrality becomes stable, something powerful happens. The memory becomes just a memory, without charge, without pull, without emotional control. And that is freedom, not forgetting, not suppressing, but remembering without being pulled back in. Now we reach one of the most sensitive stages of forgiveness, because at this point, it is no longer just about the memory. It is about who you became because of the memory. When emotional pain lasts long enough, it does something very subtle to identity. It gives you a role, a psychological position in life. You stop being just a person who experienced something and slowly become the one who was hurt, the one who was betrayed, the one who was abandoned, the one who cannot forget. And without realizing it, that role becomes familiar, even meaningful, because it explains your emotions, it explains your reactions, it explains your patterns. So the mind clings to it, not because it is healthy, but because it is known. Now here is the paradox. Even suffering can become a form of identity structure, and the brain prefers a painful identity over no identity at all. Because identity gives stability. It tells the mind, this is who I am. This is how I respond. This is my story. So when forgiveness begins to take effect, something unusual happens. The emotional charge starts to fade. And with it, the identity built around that charge begins to weaken. This creates a psychological discomfort that many people do not recognize. They think they are still healing. But in reality, they are experiencing identity loosening. And the mind resists this strongly, because it feels like losing part of the self, even if that part was built from pain. Now here is something very important. This is the stage where people often go back to old thoughts, not because they are not healing, but because the brain is trying to re-establish a familiar self-concept. It is saying, let me think about it again, so I know who I am. But every time you re-enter the story, you reinforce the old identity again. This is why forgiveness is not a single moment. It is a transition of identity, from a story-based self to an awareness-based self. Now let's go deeper. There is another hidden reason why people resist forgiveness. Pain gives purpose, not real purpose, but psychological purpose. When you are hurt, the mind stays busy, analyzing, replaying, understanding, protecting. It creates constant mental activity. and that activity feels like direction. So when forgiveness begins, that activity slows down, and suddenly there is silence. And silence feels like emptiness to a mind used to emotional noise. So instead of peace, it is interpreted as loss. But what is really happening is very different. The mind is losing its dependency on emotional stimulation. And this is a major shift, because rumination over time becomes a false sense of purpose. It gives the illusion that something important is still being processed. But in reality, it is just repetition without resolution. Now here is the most important insight in this stage. You are not losing meaning. You are losing attachment to emotional suffering as meaning. And that distinction is everything. Because once the identity built on pain begins to dissolve, a new type of self becomes possible. One that is not defined by what happened to you, but by your present awareness. Now let's make this very clear. Forgiveness is not the destruction of identity. It is the loosening of identity built on emotional repetition. And when that loosening stabilizes, something very powerful emerges. Space, mental space, emotional space, a gap between memory and reaction. In that space, you are no longer inside the story. You are observing it, and that observation, without re-entry, is where freedom begins. Not because the past disappears, but because it no longer defines the present. And that is the beginning of true psychological liberation. Now we reach the final understanding. Everything we discussed leads to this point, because forgiveness is not a single thought, and it is not a moral decision. It is the moment the emotional loop stops feeding itself. That is all. When rumination is active, the mind keeps the story alive. When the story is alive, the nervous system stays activated, and when the nervous system is activated, you remain emotionally inside the past. But when something changes, not in the past, but in your engagement with the past, the entire system begins to shift. Now let's bring everything together. Rumination is repetition without resolution. It is the mind looping through emotional memory, trying to find meaning, control, or closure. But what it actually creates is reinforcement. Every replay strengthens the emotional pathway. Every analysis deepens the identity connection. Every revisit keeps the wound active. Forgiveness begins when this cycle is interrupted. Not perfectly, not forever at first, but gradually, through moments of non-engagement. Moments where the story appears, but you do not enter it. This is the turning point, because the brain only maintains emotional pain through participation. Remove participation, and the system begins to weaken. Now here is the deepest truth in this entire psychology. You were never stuck in the past. You were stuck in repetition of the past. The past itself is finished, but the mind kept reopening it, and every time it reopened, it felt real again. So forgiveness is not erasing history. It is stopping the reactivation of history. Now let's go even deeper. At a biological level, the brain is constantly updating based on what you repeatedly focus on. So, when you stop feeding a painful loop, the neural network associated with that pain slowly loses strength, not instantly, but naturally, like a pathway in a forest that is no longer walked. It begins to fade, and as that fades, something new becomes possible. Neutral memory, a memory that exists, but does not control your emotional state. This is the real goal of forgiveness. Not forgetting, not forcing positivity, but neutrality. Now here is the final shift. Forgiveness is not something you do to the past. It is something you do to your attention in the present. Because attention is the fuel of emotional experience. Whatever you repeatedly attend to, you strengthen. Whatever you withdraw attention from, you weaken. So when you stop reliving the story, you are not suppressing it. You are simply no longer activating it. And without activation, emotion cannot survive in its original intensity. Now let's bring it home. Rumination keeps you emotionally trapped in time. Forgiveness returns you to the present. Rumination builds identity around pain. Forgiveness dissolves identity built on repetition. Rumination feels like control. Forgiveness feels like uncertainty at first. But that uncertainty is not danger. It is freedom forming. Because when the mind is no longer locked in repetition, a new internal state appears. Stillness, clarity, distance from emotional reactivity. And in that space, you are no longer the memory. You are the awareness observing the memory. And that shift is everything. Because once you are the observer, the story no longer owns you. It simply exists, and you exist beyond it. This is the psychology of forgiveness. Not suppression, not justification, not forgetting, but the end of emotional repetition, the end of the loop. And when the loop ends, you do not become someone new. You return to who you were before the loop began. Clear, present, free.